Sometimes the most dangerous person in a room is the one who looks least threatening. In a world where strength is measured by size and intimidation by volume, there exists a different kind of warrior. One who moves through shadows, strikes without warning, and disappears before anyone realizes what happened. This is the story of Lieutenant Sarah Chun, a woman whose quiet demeanor masked years of the most brutal military training on Earth. What started as 3 arrogant recruits trying to prove their dominance over a weak female instructor ended in 45 seconds of pure, calculated destruction that would become legend in military circles. This wasn't just about teaching respect or proving a point. This was about the moment when 3 young men learned that the deadliest weapons come in unexpected packages. The gym fell silent. The witnesses held their breath. And in less than a minute, everything these recruits thought they knew about strength, courage, and what it means to be a warrior was shattered completely. This is that story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility in Coronado, California. Lieutenant Sarah Chun adjusted her black instructor polo shirt and checked her watch. 5 minutes until the new batch of recruits would file into her combat training session. At 5 feet 4 inches and weighing barely 130 pounds, Sarah knew exactly what those young men would think when they saw her. She had seen that look countless times before. The barely concealed smirks, the exchanged glances, the subtle eye rolls that said everything about their expectations. Sarah walked through the empty gymnasium, her soft-soled training shoes making no sound on the polished floor. The space was impressive. High ceilings, mirrored walls, and every piece of equipment needed to transform ordinary people into extraordinary warriors. Heavy bags hung from chains, wrestling mats covered one section of the floor, and weight machines lined the far wall. This was her domain, and she knew every inch of it intimately. She had arrived at this moment through a path that few could imagine and fewer still could survive. Born in San Francisco to immigrant parents who ran a small restaurant, Sarah had grown up understanding the value of hard work and persistence. Her father, David Chun, had served briefly in the Taiwanese military before immigrating to America. Her mother, Linda, was a second-generation Chinese-American who believed education was the key to success. Neither parent had military aspirations for their quiet, studious daughter who seemed more interested in books than battles. Sarah's journey toward becoming a Navy SEAL had begun in an unlikely place, her high school's mixed martial arts club. What started as a way to build confidence had revealed something unexpected. While other students struggled with basic techniques, Sarah absorbed every lesson like a sponge. Her instructor, a former Marine named Carlos Rodriguez, recognized something special in the way she moved. Her balance was natural, her reflexes sharp, and, most importantly, she possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain calm under pressure. During her sophomore year, Sarah experienced an incident that would shape her entire future. Walking home from school through a rough neighborhood, she encountered 3 older teenagers who thought a small Asian girl with a backpack full of textbooks would make an easy target. They were wrong. Using techniques she had learned in her martial arts club, Sarah disabled 2 of her attackers and sent the 3rd running. The entire encounter lasted less than 30 seconds. More importantly, Sarah felt no fear during the confrontation, only a cold, calculating clarity that seemed to slow time itself. Word of the incident reached her martial arts instructor, who recommended Sarah for a summer program designed to introduce high school students to military careers. The program was held at a nearby military base and included everything from basic combat training to leadership exercises. Sarah thrived in an environment that most teenagers found intimidating. While her peers complained about early morning runs and strict discipline, Sarah discovered she felt most at home when pushed to her absolute limits. The turning point came during a survival exercise. Teams of 4 students were dropped in a wilderness area with minimal supplies and required to navigate back to base camp within 48 hours. Sarah's team included 2 football players who assumed they would naturally take leadership roles and a quiet kid named Marcus who seemed completely out of his element. When the football players immediately began arguing about which direction to go, Sarah studied their map and compass while listening carefully to the instructions they had been given. Within the first hour, it became clear that her teammates' confidence far exceeded their competence. They were making too much noise, moving too fast, and rapidly depleting their water supplies. Sarah tried to offer suggestions, but was dismissed with comments about letting the guys handle it. By nightfall, they were lost, dehydrated, and completely demoralized. That's when Sarah quietly took control. Using skills she had taught herself through countless hours of reading survival manuals and practicing in local forests, Sarah led her team to a water source, helped them construct a proper shelter, and guided them safely back to base camp with 6 hours to spare. More importantly, she did it without ever raising her voice or demanding recognition. The instructors noticed. More specifically, Lieutenant Commander James Morrison, a former SEAL who was helping run the program, pulled Sarah aside on the final day. Morrison was not a man given to excessive praise or encouragement. He had survived 3 combat deployments and trained hundreds of young warriors. When he looked at Sarah Chun, he saw something that couldn't be taught, a combination of physical capability, mental toughness, and emotional control that was rarer than diamonds. He asked her a simple question that would change her life. Have you ever considered serving your country? That conversation planted a seed that grew throughout Sarah's final years of high school. She researched military careers, focusing particularly on Special Operations Forces. The more she learned about Navy SEALs, the more she felt drawn to their mission. These weren't just soldiers. They were thinking warriors who used intelligence, training, and teamwork to accomplish impossible missions. When she discovered that women were beginning to be accepted into previously all-male special operations units, Sarah knew she had found her calling. The application process for the Naval Academy was grueling. Sarah needed perfect grades, outstanding test scores, and recommendations from community leaders. She also needed to pass rigorous physical and psychological evaluations. While maintaining a 4.0 grade average, Sarah spent every free moment training. She ran before school, lifted weights after classes, and practiced swimming until the pool staff had to ask her to leave. Her parents watched their once studious daughter transform into something they barely recognized, and they were both proud and terrified. The Naval Academy proved to be exactly the challenge Sarah craved. While many of her classmates struggled with the transition from civilian life to military discipline, Sarah adapted almost immediately. She excelled in her studies, particularly in courses related to strategy and tactics. Her professors noted her unusual ability to think several moves ahead, like a chess master planning an elaborate endgame. During leadership exercises, Sarah demonstrated a rare combination of decisiveness and humility that earned respect from both instructors and fellow midshipmen. Physical training remained Sarah's greatest strength. She consistently scored in the top 1% of her class on fitness evaluations, despite being smaller than most of her peers. Her running times were remarkable, her swimming was exceptional, and her performance on obstacle courses bordered on superhuman. More importantly, she never seemed to reach her breaking point. While others collapsed from exhaustion, Sarah simply adjusted her pace and continued. During her junior year, Sarah participated in an exchange program with British Royal Marines. The experience exposed her to different training methods and combat philosophies. She learned about close-quarters battle techniques that emphasize speed and precision over brute force. She studied urban warfare tactics that relied on intelligence and stealth rather than overwhelming firepower. Most significantly, she worked with instructors who evaluated her potential for special operations service. The British assessment was unambiguous. Sarah Chun possessed all the qualities necessary for elite military service. She was physically capable, mentally tough, emotionally stable, and demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure. When she returned to the Naval Academy, Sarah was approached by recruiters from various special operations communities. The SEALs were particularly interested in her combination of skills and potential. SEAL training, officially known as Basic Underwater Demolition/SEAL Training or BUD/S, was widely regarded as the most difficult military program in the world. The statistics were sobering. Roughly 80% of candidates failed to complete the course. Those who did succeed were considered among the most elite warriors on Earth. Sarah understood the odds, but she also knew that statistics only told part of the story. She had never attempted anything that truly challenged her limits. BUD/S would be that test. The selection process began months before actual training. Sarah underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluations designed to identify potential weaknesses. She completed underwater swimming tests that eliminated many strong candidates. She demonstrated her ability to remain calm during simulated combat scenarios that pushed most people beyond their breaking points. Every evaluation confirmed what military assessors already suspected. Sarah Chun was built for this type of challenge. BUD/S lasted 24 weeks and was divided into 3 phases. First phase focused on physical conditioning and water skills. Candidates ran countless miles, performed thousands of push-ups and sit-ups, and spent endless hours in cold Pacific Ocean water. This was where most people quit, usually during the notorious Hell Week. 5.5 days of continuous training with minimal sleep and constant physical stress. Sarah approached first phase like she approached everything else, methodically and without emotion. She studied the training schedule and prepared accordingly. She researched nutrition strategies that would help her maintain energy during long days of physical stress. She practiced meditation techniques that would help her stay focused when instructors were screaming in her face. Most importantly, she developed a mental framework that treated pain and exhaustion as information rather than problems to be solved. Hell Week tested every aspect of Sarah's preparation. 4 or 5 days and nights, she and her classmates carried heavy boats above their heads, crawled through mud under barbed wire, and performed endless physical exercises in freezing water. Instructors used psychological pressure tactics designed to break the will of even the strongest candidates. They screamed insults, created artificial emergencies, and constantly reminded candidates that they could quit at any time simply by ringing a bell. Sarah never considered ringing the bell. While other candidates broke down emotionally or collapsed from physical exhaustion, she remained focused on the next task, the next mile, the next evolution. Her small size actually became an advantage during certain exercises that required crawling through tight spaces or maintaining balance in unstable conditions. More importantly, her calm demeanor helped stabilize her boat crew when other members began to falter. By the end of first phase, Sarah's class had shrunk from 120 candidates to 38. She was among the top performers in every category and had earned the respect of instructors who were not easily impressed. But she also understood that the hardest challenges lay ahead. Second phase focused on land warfare skills, including weapons training, small unit tactics, and demolitions. This was where Sarah's intellectual capabilities became as important as her physical conditioning. She learned to operate dozens of different weapons systems, from pistols to machine guns to rocket launchers. She studied explosive ordnance and practiced calculating precise charges needed to destroy specific targets. Most importantly, she learned to think like a warrior rather than simply an athlete. Combat scenarios during second phase were designed to simulate real-world conditions that SEALs might encounter during actual missions. Sarah and her teammates practiced urban warfare techniques in mock cities. They learned to clear buildings methodically while minimizing civilian casualties. They studied close-quarters battle skills that could save their lives during unexpected encounters with enemy forces. Every exercise reinforced the same lesson. Successful special operations required perfect integration of individual skills and team coordination. Sarah's performance during second phase established her reputation among instructors and fellow candidates. She consistently scored highest on written examinations covering tactics and weapons systems. Her shooting accuracy was exceptional, particularly with pistols and rifles during close-quarter scenarios. During demolitions training, she demonstrated an unusual aptitude for calculating explosive charges needed for complex demolition tasks. But her greatest strength remained her ability to remain calm and focused during chaotic, high-stress situations. Third phase concentrated on maritime operations and diving skills. SEALs were primarily naval special warfare operators, and their maritime capabilities distinguished them from other special operations forces. Sarah learned to use diving equipment for extended underwater operations. She practiced underwater demolitions, submarine infiltration techniques, and amphibious assault tactics. Most challenging of all, she completed dive operations in conditions that pushed human endurance to absolute limits. The final exercise of BUD/S was a 20-mile ocean swim performed in teams of 2. Candidates had to navigate from the training facility to a pickup point down the coast while avoiding detection by instructor boats. The water temperature was 58 degrees, waves reached 6 feet, and swimmers had to complete the distance within a specific time limit. This evolution eliminated several candidates who had survived everything else BUD/S could throw at them. Sarah completed the swim with 15 minutes to spare, despite helping her swim partner, who began experiencing hypothermia during the final miles. Her ability to remain focused and effective while dealing with her own physical distress and her partner's emergency perfectly demonstrated the qualities that made her special. When she emerged from the ocean at the designated pickup point, Sarah had officially become one of the few women ever to complete Navy SEAL training. Graduation from BUD/S was only the beginning of Sarah's journey toward becoming a fully qualified SEAL operator. She still needed to complete advanced training in parachuting, advanced weapon systems, and specialized combat techniques. She would undergo months of additional instruction covering everything from foreign languages to advanced medical training. Only after completing this entire pipeline would she be assigned to an operational SEAL team and begin her career as a special warfare operator. But standing in that gymnasium in Coronado, preparing to meet her first group of students as an instructor, Sarah represented something unprecedented. She was living proof that the most dangerous warriors don't always look dangerous. Her quiet competence and unassuming appearance masked capabilities that few humans possessed. In just a few minutes, 3 arrogant recruits would learn this lesson in a way they would never forget. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway outside the gymnasium. Sarah's students were arriving. She checked her equipment one final time, took a deep breath, and prepared to begin another day of transforming ordinary people into extraordinary warriors. She had no way of knowing that this particular day would become legendary throughout the special operations community. The door opened, and 24 young men filed into the gymnasium. Sarah studied each face as they entered, noting their body language, their confidence levels, and their attitudes toward finding a woman waiting to instruct them. Most showed appropriate respect and curiosity. A few seemed genuinely interested in learning from someone who had accomplished something they aspired to achieve. But 3 faces stood out for all the wrong reasons. Sarah recognized the type immediately. Young men who confused arrogance with confidence, who believed physical size automatically translated to fighting ability, and who had never encountered anyone capable of humbling their inflated egos. Their names were Danny Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Marcus Torres. Within the hour, they would provide Sarah with an opportunity to deliver a lesson they would remember for the rest of their lives. Danny Morrison stood 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighed 215 pounds of what he considered pure muscle. The son of a construction worker from Detroit, Danny had grown up believing that physical strength was the ultimate measure of a person's worth. He had dominated high school football, intimidated smaller kids throughout his teenage years, and generally succeeded through size and aggression rather than skill or intelligence. When military recruiters visited his high school, Danny saw the Navy as an opportunity to prove his superiority on a larger stage. Jake Sullivan came from a completely different background but shared Danny's fundamental worldview. The son of a wealthy Boston attorney, Jake had attended expensive private schools where his aggressive personality and family connections had protected him from consequences. At 6 feet, even, and 190 pounds, Jake was smaller than Danny, but made up for it with a mean streak that had gotten him expelled from 2 prep schools. He viewed military service as an adventure that would provide stories to tell at country club gatherings for the rest of his life. Marcus Torres represented a third type of problematic recruit. Born in Phoenix to a family with deep military traditions, Marcus had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's heroism during World War II and his father's service in Vietnam. At 5 feet 10 inches and 180 pounds, Marcus was physically unremarkable, but he carried himself with the entitlement of someone who believed military greatness was his birthright. He had never been tested, never been challenged, and never encountered anyone who refused to accept his inflated opinion of himself. When the 3 young men entered Sarah's gymnasium and saw a small Asian woman wearing instructor credentials, their reactions were predictable. Danny's face showed barely concealed amusement. Jake whispered something to Marcus that caused both men to snicker. Marcus simply shook his head as if witnessing some cosmic joke. None of them considered the possibility that their assumptions might be dangerously wrong. Sarah began the session with a standard introduction. She explained her background in general terms, outlined the training objectives for their time together, and established basic safety protocols. She spoke in a calm, professional tone that gave no indication of her growing awareness that trouble was developing. 21 of her students listened respectfully and asked appropriate questions. 3 students exchanged glances, whispered comments, and made their attitude clear through body language that Sarah cataloged carefully. The morning's first exercise involved basic hand-to-hand combat techniques. Sarah demonstrated proper stance, footwork, and defensive positioning while explaining the principles behind each movement. She emphasized that effective combat skills depended more on technique, timing, and mental preparation than on raw physical strength. This concept clearly annoyed Danny, who had succeeded his entire life through intimidation and brute force. During partner drills, Sarah moved throughout the gymnasium, observing her students and offering corrections. Most of the recruits were eager to learn and responsive to instruction. They practiced the techniques seriously and asked thoughtful questions when they encountered difficulties. But the 3 problem students approached the exercises with obvious disdain. They performed the movements carelessly, ignored Sarah's corrections, and continued their whispered commentary. When Sarah approached Danny to correct his form, the situation began to escalate. Danny was practicing with a smaller partner and using far more force than necessary. His movements were sloppy, his balance was poor, and his technique showed fundamental misunderstandings of basic principles. Sarah stepped in to demonstrate the proper method. "Morrison, you're telegraphing your movements," Sarah said calmly. "Your opponent can see what you're planning from 3 seconds away. Also, you're using too much muscle and not enough technique. Let me show you." Danny's response was telling. Instead of accepting instruction gracefully, he rolled his eyes and exchanged another glance with Jake. "Ma'am, I think I've got this figured out," he said with barely concealed contempt. "I've been in plenty of fights, and I know what works." Sarah recognized the moment immediately. This wasn't about combat techniques or proper form. This was about respect, authority, and 3 young men who needed to learn that their assumptions about strength and capability were fundamentally flawed. She also understood that 21 other students were watching carefully to see how she would handle the challenge to her authority. "I'm sure you have experience," Sarah replied evenly. "But military combat and street fighting are completely different. The techniques we're learning here could save your life or the lives of your teammates someday. Would you mind if I demonstrated the difference?" Danny's smile became openly mocking. "Sure, ma'am. Show me what you've got." Sarah positioned herself in a basic fighting stance, and gestured for Danny to attempt the technique he had been practicing incorrectly. The exercise involved a simple defensive movement designed to counter a straight punch. Danny approached the drill with obvious confidence, clearly believing that his size advantage would make the lesson irrelevant. What happened next occurred too quickly for most observers to follow completely. Danny threw a punch that was powerful but predictable. Sarah didn't try to block or absorb the impact. Instead, she used his momentum against him, redirecting his energy while simultaneously compromising his balance. In less than 2 seconds, Danny found himself face down on the mat with Sarah's knee pressing lightly against his spine and his right arm twisted at an uncomfortable angle. The gymnasium fell completely silent. Danny struggled briefly, then realized that any movement only increased his discomfort. Sarah held the position for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make her point, but not long enough to humiliate unnecessarily. Then she released him and stepped back, offering her hand to help him up. That's the difference between using strength and using technique, Sarah said, as if nothing unusual had happened. Your punch was powerful, but it left you completely vulnerable to a counterattack. In a real combat situation, that vulnerability could be fatal. Danny climbed to his feet with his face burning red from embarrassment and anger. Jake and Marcus watched the demonstration with expressions that had changed from amusement to something approaching concern. But rather than learning from the experience, all 3 men seemed to interpret Sarah's display as a personal challenge that demanded response. The rest of the morning session proceeded without further incident, but Sarah could feel the tension building. During water breaks, the 3 problem students huddled together in whispered conversations. They shot hostile glances in her direction and clearly viewed her demonstration as some kind of trick rather than legitimate skill. Sarah recognized the signs. She had seen this pattern before with young men whose egos couldn't accept being outperformed by someone they considered inferior. The afternoon session focused on defensive tactics and situational awareness. Sarah explained how military personnel needed to remain alert to potential threats in any environment, whether on base, in civilian areas, or in combat zones. She demonstrated basic techniques for recognizing danger, avoiding conflicts when possible, and responding appropriately when avoidance wasn't an option. During a break between exercises, Jake Sullivan approached Sarah with what appeared to be a reasonable question about military careers and special operations. But his real purpose became clear when he steered the conversation toward her qualifications and experience. Jake was fishing for information he could use to undermine her credibility. "So, instructor, have you actually been in combat?" Jake asked with false curiosity. "I mean real combat, not just training exercises." Sarah recognized the trap immediately. If she revealed details about classified missions, she would be violating security protocols. If she refused to answer, Jake would claim she lacked real-world experience. Either response could be used to question her authority and expertise. "I've completed the same training and qualification standards as any SEAL operator," Sarah replied carefully. "My job here is to teach you skills that might save your life someday. The specific details of my service record aren't really relevant to your learning objectives." Jake's expression suggested he considered her response evasive and unsatisfactory. It's just that some of us are wondering whether someone who's never actually been tested in real combat can teach us how to survive real combat situations. The challenge was now explicit. Jake was questioning Sarah's credibility in front of her entire class and demanding that she prove herself worthy of their respect. Sarah understood that her response would determine whether she could maintain classroom control or whether the situation would continue to deteriorate. "That's a fair question," Sarah said calmly. "Combat experience is valuable, and I understand your concerns about training quality. But the techniques I'm teaching you have been developed and refined by operators with extensive combat experience. My job is to ensure you learn those techniques correctly." Marcus Torres chose that moment to join the conversation. "But how do we know you actually know what you're talking about? I mean, no offense, but You don't exactly look like someone who could survive a real fight." The statement hung in the air like a challenge. 21 students waited to see how their instructor would respond to what amounted to a direct insult. Sarah felt the familiar calm that always preceded action. She had reached the point where talking would no longer resolve the situation. These three young men needed a demonstration that would permanently adjust their attitude and understanding. "You're absolutely right to question your instruction," Sarah said thoughtfully. "Military training is too important for anyone to accept it on faith. If you have doubts about my qualifications, we should address those doubts directly." Sarah walked to the center of the gymnasium and gestured for the three men to join her. "Morrison, Sullivan, Torres, please come here. We're going to settle this question right now." The three recruits approached with expressions ranging from eager anticipation to nervous excitement. They had been building toward this moment all day, and now they were getting exactly what they wanted, an opportunity to prove that their instructor was a fraud and that their assumptions about strength and combat effectiveness were correct. Sarah looked at each man carefully, assessing their physical capabilities, mental state, and level of preparation. Danny was the largest and strongest, but also the most emotional and least controlled. Jake was smaller but more calculating and potentially more dangerous. Marcus was the wild card, physically capable but untested and overconfident based on family military history rather than personal achievement. "Here's what we're going to do," Sarah announced to the entire class. "These three men have legitimate concerns about my qualifications to teach combat techniques. We're going to resolve those concerns through a practical demonstration." She paused to ensure she had everyone's complete attention. "Morrison, Sullivan, and Torres will work together to attempt to subdue me using any techniques they choose. No weapons, but otherwise no restrictions. The exercise will continue until either they succeed in restraining me or they choose to stop." The gymnasium became absolutely silent. 21 students stared in disbelief at their instructor, who appeared to be volunteering for what looked like a severely unfair fight. Danny, Jake, and Marcus exchanged glances that mixed excitement with sudden uncertainty. They had expected to challenge Sarah's authority, but they hadn't anticipated anything this direct. "Ma'am, are you sure about this?" asked one of the other students. "I mean, 3 against 1 seems kind of unfair." Sarah completed the thought with a slight smile. "You're probably right, but sometimes life is unfair. Sometimes military personnel find themselves outnumbered and outgunned. The question isn't whether the situation is fair. The question is whether you have the skills and mindset to survive anyway." She looked directly at her 3 challengers. "Gentlemen, you've spent all day questioning my credentials and my ability to teach you anything useful. Here's your chance to prove your point. If you can restrain me, you'll have demonstrated that my techniques don't work and my instruction is worthless. If you can't," she shrugged, "well, maybe you'll learn something." Danny Morrison cracked his knuckles and stretched his neck. Jake Sullivan removed his sweatshirt to improve his mobility. Marcus Torres took a deep breath and tried to appear confident. All 3 men were beginning to realize that their instructor was either completely delusional or far more dangerous than she appeared. Given her calm demeanor and obvious confidence, they were starting to suspect the latter possibility. "Take your positions," Sarah said quietly. "Begin when you're ready." The 3 men spread out in a loose triangle formation around Sarah, who stood relaxed in the center of the mat. 21 witnesses formed a circle around the action, uncertain whether they were about to watch a demonstration or a disaster. The tension in the gymnasium was almost unbearable as everyone waited to see how this unprecedented confrontation would unfold. Danny made the first move, charging directly at Sarah with obvious intention to use his size advantage for a quick takedown. Jake circled to Sarah's left while Marcus moved right, both men planning to attack simultaneously once Danny engaged. Their strategy was simple, logical, and completely inadequate for the situation they were actually facing. Sarah Chun had spent years training for exactly this type of scenario. She had practiced against multiple opponents countless times under conditions far more challenging than anything 3 untrained recruits could provide. More importantly, she possessed something her attackers completely lacked: the mental clarity that comes from absolute confidence in one's abilities. The 45 seconds that followed would become the stuff of legend throughout the special operations community. But in that moment before action began, Sarah simply stood quietly and waited for her lesson to commence. Time seemed to slow as Danny Morrison launched himself towards Sarah with the confidence of someone who had never encountered real opposition. His approach was everything wrong with untrained aggression, telegraphed, unbalanced, and completely predictable. Sarah read his intention from the moment his weight shifted, tracking his movement with the same calm precision she might use to observe a training film. Danny's charge was designed to use his superior size and strength to overwhelm his target through sheer momentum. In his limited experience, this approach had always worked. Smaller opponents were supposed to be intimidated, overwhelmed, and quickly subdued by superior physical force. What Danny didn't understand was that momentum becomes a liability when facing someone who knows how to redirect it. Sarah waited until Danny was completely committed to his attack, then moved with surgical precision. Instead of trying to stop or absorb his charge, she stepped slightly to her left while simultaneously grabbing Danny's extended arm. Using his own momentum and a textbook hip toss, Sarah redirected 215 pounds of charging recruit into a controlled trajectory that ended with Danny impacting the mat with enough force to drive all the air from his lungs. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. Danny went from confident attacker to gasping on the gymnasium floor before his brain could process what had happened. But Sarah was already moving because Jake and Marcus had used Danny's charge as cover for their own simultaneous assault. Jake Sullivan approached from Sarah's left with more caution than Danny had shown, but with no more skill. Jake had learned some rudimentary boxing techniques and believed his knowledge of punching and footwork gave him significant advantages. He planned to use his superior reach to land several quick strikes, while Marcus attacked from the opposite direction. The strategy showed more tactical thinking than Danny's straightforward charge, but it was still completely inadequate. Sarah pivoted toward Jake as he closed distance, making herself a more difficult target for Marcus while focusing her attention on the more immediate threat. Jake threw a combination of punches that demonstrated his amateur boxing training. They were properly thrown but lacked the speed, precision, and deceptive qualities that made strikes effective against trained opponents. Sarah slipped Jake's first punch with minimal movement, letting it pass inches from her face while stepping inside his guard. His second punch was redirected with a simple parry that left Jake momentarily off balance and completely vulnerable. Sarah's counterattack was a perfect demonstration of why technique trumps strength in trained hands. Her strike was not designed to cause serious injury. This was a teaching moment, not a combat situation. But it was precisely placed and perfectly timed to achieve maximum effect with minimum effort. Sarah's palm strike caught Jake just below his solar plexus, temporarily paralyzing his diaphragm and dropping him to his knees as he struggled to breathe. Marcus Torres watched his two companions neutralized with shocking efficiency and, suddenly, realized that he was facing someone completely outside his experience or understanding. Marcus had grown up on stories of military heroism and had always assumed that courage and determination were the primary qualities that made warriors effective. He was about to learn that training and skill mattered far more than attitude and family tradition. To his credit, Marcus didn't hesitate or try to retreat. Despite watching two larger, stronger men dispatched with ease, he continued his attack with the kind of determination that his grandfather would have recognized and approved. Unfortunately, determination without capability is simply another form of suicide. Marcus attempted to tackle Sarah around the waist, hoping to use his weight to drive her to the ground where he might have some advantage. His technique was better than Danny's had been, and his timing was reasonably good. Under normal circumstances, his approach might have succeeded against an untrained opponent. But Marcus wasn't facing normal circumstances. Sarah read Marcus's intentions and adjusted accordingly. As he reached for her waist, she dropped her center of gravity and used his own momentum to execute a perfectly timed sprawl that left Marcus grasping empty air while she positioned herself behind him. Before Marcus could recover his balance or reorient himself, Sarah had applied a rear naked choke that immediately cut off blood flow to his brain. Marcus struggled for approximately 3 seconds before the lack of oxygen forced him into unconsciousness. Sarah released the choke the moment she felt his body go limp, carefully lowering him to the mat and checking his pulse to ensure he was uninjured. Marcus would wake up in less than a minute with nothing worse than a bruised ego and a completely revised understanding of combat reality. The entire confrontation had lasted exactly 43 seconds. 3 confident young men who had questioned their instructor's qualifications were now either unconscious or struggling to breathe, while their supposedly weak and inexperienced teacher stood calmly among them, showing no signs of exertion or stress. 21 witnesses stood in absolute silence, trying to process what they had just observed. Most of them had never seen real hand-to-hand combat, and none had imagined that such a brief encounter could demonstrate such a dramatic disparity in fighting capability. Sarah had just provided a masterclass in the difference between untrained aggression and professional skill. Danny Morrison was the first to recover enough to speak. Still lying on his back and struggling to catch his breath, he looked up at Sarah with an expression of complete bewilderment. "How did you what just?" he gasped before running out of words entirely. Jake Sullivan remained on his knees, holding his midsection and gradually regaining the ability to breathe normally. His face showed a mixture of pain, embarrassment, and grudging respect that suggested the lesson was beginning to penetrate his consciousness. Marcus Torres was still unconscious, but showing signs of returning awareness. Sarah surveyed her 3 challengers with the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the entire incident. She showed no triumph, no satisfaction, and no desire to humiliate men who had already learned their lesson. Instead, she knelt beside Marcus to monitor his condition while addressing the entire class. "Torres will be fine in a moment," she said matter-of-factly. "He's unconscious but uninjured. Sullivan, your breathing will return to normal within the next minute. Morrison, you might be sore tomorrow, but there's no significant damage." She stood and faced her students, all of whom were staring at her with completely revised opinions about their instructor's qualifications and capabilities. "What you just witnessed wasn't about me being tougher or stronger than these 3 men. It was about the difference between trained skills and untrained aggression." Marcus Torres groaned and opened his eyes, immediately trying to sit up before Sarah gently restrained him. "Take a moment, Torres. You were unconscious for about 30 seconds. Just breathe normally and let your body recover." As Marcus gradually regained full consciousness, Sarah continued her impromptu lecture. Morrison charged like he was trying to tackle a quarterback. His approach was completely telegraphed, unbalanced, and easy to counter. Sullivan used basic boxing techniques, but he hadn't learned how to deal with someone who could slip his punches and counterattack. Torres showed good determination, but he attempted a wrestling takedown without understanding defensive sprawls or submission holds. She paused to ensure all 3 men were listening and able to understand her words. "None of you are weak or cowardly. You all showed willingness to engage in physical confrontation, which many people lack. But willingness isn't enough in real combat situations. You need training, technique, and the kind of mental conditioning that only comes from years of proper instruction." Danny Morrison struggled to a sitting position, still looking dazed by the speed and effectiveness of Sarah's response to his attack. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "I'm twice your size. I work out every day. I've been in dozens of fights. How'd you make it look so easy?" Sarah's answer would become one of the most quoted explanations of combat effectiveness in military training circles. Morrison, you've been in dozens of fights against people who didn't know how to fight. You've succeeded because size and aggression work against untrained opponents. But every technique you use today would get you killed against a trained enemy. She gestured to the three men who were now listening with complete attention. Your charge was powerful, but it committed your entire body to a single line of attack. Any trained fighter could have seen it coming and countered it. Sullivan, your boxing techniques were properly thrown, but you hadn't learned how to deal with close-quarters fighting or someone who could slip your punches. Torres, your takedown attempt showed good instincts, but you didn't understand the defensive techniques that every wrestler learns. Jake Sullivan had recovered enough to speak, though he remained seated on the mat. So this is what real training looks like, he asked with obvious newfound respect. This is what happens when you spend years learning how to fight against people who know how to fight back, Sarah confirmed. Every SEAL has practiced these techniques thousands of times against opponents who are trying their best to defeat them. We've learned how to remain calm under pressure, how to recognize opportunities, and how to execute techniques precisely when those opportunities appear. She looked around at her entire class, making eye contact with each student to emphasize her next point. What happened here wasn't magic or luck. It was the result of training, practice, and mental conditioning that you'll receive if you're willing to work for it. But you have to understand that real combat skills take years to develop and require constant practice to maintain. Marcus Torres had fully recovered and was sitting up with his back against the gymnasium wall. His family's military tradition had always emphasized courage and honor, but no one had ever explained to him that modern warfare required technical skills that took years to master. "How long did it take you to learn how to do that?" he asked quietly. "I've been training in martial arts since high school," Sarah replied. "I spent 4 years at the Naval Academy learning military skills and tactics. I completed 6 months of SEAL training followed by another year of advanced instruction in weapons, tactics, and specialized combat techniques. Even after all that preparation, I continue to train regularly to maintain my skills and learn new techniques." She smiled for the first time since the confrontation began. The good news is that you don't need to become Navy SEALs to benefit from proper training. The basic techniques I'll teach you over the next few weeks will make you far more capable than you are today. But you have to approach the instruction with the right attitude. Danny Morrison climbed slowly to his feet, testing his balance and checking for injuries. His entire worldview had been shattered in less than a minute, and he was struggling to process the implications. "So everything I thought I knew about fighting was wrong?" "Not wrong," Sarah corrected. "Limited. Size and strength matter in combat situations. Aggression and determination matter, but they're not enough by themselves. You need to learn how to use those advantages properly, and you need to understand their limitations." She gestured for the three men to rejoin their classmates. The most important lesson from this demonstration is that combat effectiveness comes from training, not genetics or attitude. Anyone can learn these skills if they're willing to invest the time and effort required. But you have to check your ego at the door and accept that you have a lot to learn. The remainder of the training session proceeded with completely different dynamics. Danny, Jake, and Marcus listened to every instruction with newfound attention and respect. They practiced techniques carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and showed none of the dismissive attitude that had characterized their earlier behavior. More importantly, their attitude adjustment influenced the entire class. 21 other students had witnessed their instructor's capabilities and understood that they were receiving instruction from someone truly exceptional. During the final portion of the session, Sarah addressed broader lessons about military service and personal development. She explained that the military existed to accomplish missions that required extraordinary skill, dedication, and teamwork. Service members who thought they already knew everything they needed to know were dangerous to themselves and their teammates. "The enemy you'll face someday has been training just as hard as you have," Sarah told her students. "They're probably just as brave, just as determined, and just as willing to fight for their cause. The only advantages you'll have are better training, better equipment, and better teamwork. If you waste your training opportunities because you think you already know enough, you're setting yourself up for failure in situations where failure means death. She looked directly at Danny, Jake, and Marcus as she delivered her final point. Military service requires constant learning and constant improvement. The moment you stop growing as a warrior is the moment you become a liability to your team. Today's demonstration was designed to show you how much you still have to learn. I hope it was effective. Danny Morrison raised his hand tentatively. When Sarah nodded for him to speak, he said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. I was completely wrong about everything. I hope you'll continue working with us despite how we acted today." Jake Sullivan and Marcus Torres both nodded their agreement. The three men who had entered the gymnasium that morning as arrogant challengers were leaving as humbled students with genuine respect for their instructor and realistic understanding of their own limitations. As the class ended and students began filing out of the gymnasium, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The confrontation had been unfortunate, but necessary. Three young men had learned crucial lessons about respect, humility, and the difference between confidence and arrogance. More importantly, 21 other students had witnessed a demonstration that would influence their approach to training for months to come. The 45-second lesson would be discussed and analyzed throughout the special operations community. Instructors would use the story to illustrate points about combat effectiveness, mental conditioning, and the importance of proper training. But for Sarah, the incident was simply another day at work, another opportunity to transform cocky recruits into capable warriors who might someday serve their country with honor and distinction. Word of the gymnasium incident spread through the Naval Special Warfare Training Facility with the speed and intensity that only military gossip could achieve. By evening chow, every instructor, support staff member, and student within 20 miles had heard some version of the story. The details grew more dramatic with each retelling, but the core facts remained consistent. 3 recruits had challenged their female SEAL instructor and been systematically dismantled in less than a minute. Master Chief Petty Officer Robert Tank Williams had been training warriors for 23 years and thought he had seen everything. A massive man who had earned his nickname through his resemblance to an actual armored vehicle. Tank served as the senior enlisted advisor for the facility's combat training programs. When he heard about Sarah's demonstration, his first reaction was concern that the incident might reflect poorly on the training command's discipline and professionalism. Tank found Sarah in her office, completing the day's training reports. She looked up as he knocked on her open door, showing no signs of stress or concern about the afternoon's events. Her calm demeanor only reinforced Tank's growing respect for the young officer who had joined their team 6 months earlier. "Heard you had an interesting day, Lieutenant," Tank said as he settled his considerable bulk into the chair across from Sarah's desk. "Want to tell me what happened from your perspective?" Sarah provided a concise, professional account of the day's events, focusing on the training objectives that had been met and the lessons that had been learned. She neither minimized the seriousness of the challenge to her authority nor exaggerated the significance of her response. Tank listened without interruption, noting Sarah's matter-of-fact tone and complete lack of self-congratulation. "Any regrets about how you handled it?" Tank asked when Sarah finished her report. Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "I regret that the situation developed to the point where a physical demonstration became necessary. But once Morrison, Sullivan, and Torres made their challenge explicit, I had limited options for maintaining classroom control and credibility." Tank nodded approvingly. He had witnessed similar situations throughout his career and understood the delicate balance required to maintain authority while avoiding unnecessary confrontation. "How do you think it affected the rest of your students?" "Positively," Sarah replied without hesitation. The 21 students who weren't involved in the challenge gained a much clearer understanding of what professional combat training looks like. They also learned that respect is earned through competence rather than demanded through position or authority. Tank's expression suggested he was reaching the same conclusion. What about Morrison, Sullivan, and Torres? Think they learned anything useful? Sarah's slight smile was the first emotional expression she had shown during the conversation. All three stayed after class to ask about additional training opportunities. Morrison wants to know about martial arts programs on base. Sullivan asked about advanced tactical courses he might be eligible for. Torres requested reading material about military strategy and special operations history. Tank leaned back his chair and chuckled, a sound like boulders shifting in an avalanche. Nothing like getting your ass handed to you by a professional to clarify your priorities. Those boys might actually turn into decent operators someday. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. Commander Patricia Hayes, the training facility's executive officer, stood in the doorway with an expression that was difficult to interpret. Tank and Sarah immediately rose to attention. "As you were," Commander Hayes said, gesturing for them to sit. "I wanted to discuss today's incident while the details are still fresh. Master Chief, I'd like you to stay for this conversation." Commander Hayes was a surface warfare officer who had been assigned to the Special Warfare Training Command as part of her career development. She understood conventional Navy operations, but was still learning the unique culture and requirements of special operations training. Her reaction to Sarah's demonstration would reflect broader Navy leadership attitudes toward women in combat roles. "Lieutenant Chun, I've received several reports about an altercation in your classroom today," Commander Hayes began. "I need to understand exactly what happened and whether any disciplinary action is required." Sarah repeated her account of the day's events, this time emphasizing the challenge to her authority and the need to maintain classroom control. She explained that the three recruits had questioned her qualifications explicitly and demanded proof of her combat effectiveness. She also stressed that her response had been carefully controlled to achieve training objectives without causing injury. Commander Hayes listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific details. Tank remained silent, but his presence clearly indicated his support for Sarah's handling of the situation. When Sarah finished her report, Commander Hayes sat quietly for several moments before responding. "Lieutenant, in your assessment, was there any alternative approach that might have resolved the situation without physical confrontation?" Sarah had anticipated this question and prepared her answer carefully. "Ma'am, I attempted to address their concerns through verbal explanation and demonstration of techniques. However, the three students had made explicit challenges to my authority that undermined my ability to maintain classroom control. In my judgment, a clear demonstration of professional competence was necessary to restore the learning environment." Commander Hayes turned to Tank. "Master Chief, what's your assessment of Lieutenant Chen's handling of this situation?" Tank's response was immediate and unequivocal. "Ma'am, Lieutenant Chun faced a situation that every instructor encounters eventually. Students who refuse to accept authority and demand to be convinced through demonstration. Her response was professional, controlled, and achieved the desired training objectives without causing injury or lasting damage to student morale." He paused to ensure his next words carried appropriate emphasis. "More importantly, ma'am, Lieutenant Chen's actions demonstrated exactly the kind of professional competence that these students need to understand and respect. They learned more in 45 seconds than they might have learned in 45 hours of traditional instruction." Commander Hayes nodded slowly, clearly working through the implications of the incident and its potential impact on training programs. "What about the other students? How did they react to the demonstration?" Sarah answered immediately. "Ma'am, the other 21 students responded very positively. Their attention during subsequent instruction was exceptional, and their questions indicated much greater respect for the training program and its objectives. Several approached me after class to express appreciation for the demonstration." Tank added his own observation. "Ma'am, I've already heard from other instructors that Lieutenant Chen's students seem more engaged and focused than usual. Word of her demonstration appears to be raising the overall seriousness with which students approach their training. Commander Hayes stood and walked to the window overlooking the training complex. Several groups of students were visible conducting evening physical training under the supervision of various instructors. The scene represented the daily reality of transforming civilians into military personnel capable of extremely demanding missions. Lieutenant Shun, Commander Hayes said without turning from the window, "You're aware that women in special operations roles remain somewhat controversial within certain segments of the military community." "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied carefully. "Some people will interpret today's incident as evidence that women can't maintain authority in military training environments without resorting to physical confrontation. Others will view it as proof that women in special operations are overly aggressive and potentially dangerous to male personnel." Tank started to respond, but Commander Hayes raised her hand to indicate she wasn't finished. "However, I believe today's incident actually demonstrates something far more important, that effective military instructors maintain authority through demonstrated competence rather than assumed superiority." She turned back to face Sarah and Tank. "Lieutenant Shun, your actions today reflected exactly the kind of professional competence that we expect from all our instructors, regardless of gender. You faced a challenge to your authority, you addressed it appropriately, and you maintained classroom control while achieving positive training outcomes." Commander Hayes returned to her seat and fixed Sarah with a direct stare. "I'm not going to pretend that everyone in the chain of command will view this incident positively. Some people will criticize your methods regardless of their effectiveness. But I want you to understand that your immediate supervisors support your actions and recognize their necessity." Tank nodded his agreement. "Ma'am, if I may add something, Lieutenant Chin's demonstration today was exactly what those students needed to see. They learned that military effectiveness comes from training and skill, not from size or attitude. That's a lesson that could save their lives someday." Commander Hayes smiled for the first time during the conversation. "Master Chief, I couldn't agree more. Lieutenant Shun, I want you to document today's incident thoroughly for our training records. I suspect other instructors could benefit from understanding how you handled the situation." She stood to leave, then paused at the door. "One more thing, Lieutenant. I understand that Morrison, Sullivan, and Torres have expressed interest in additional training opportunities. I'd like you to work with Master Chief Williams to identify appropriate programs for students who show genuine motivation to improve." After Commander Hayes departed, Tank remained in Sarah's office to discuss the broader implications of the day's events. "You realize this story is going to follow you throughout your career," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Every special operations community loves stories about arrogant students getting educated by superior instructors." Sarah understood that Tank was correct, but she also recognized potential complications. "Master Chief, I'm concerned that the story might overshadow the actual training objectives and lessons learned. I don't want to become known as the instructor who fights with her students." Tank's laugh was genuinely amused. "Lieutenant, you're not going to be known as the instructor who fights with students. You're going to be known as the instructor who systematically dismantled 3 cocky recruits in 45 seconds without breaking a sweat. That's the kind of reputation that makes students pay attention from day one." He was right. Within days, Sarah's reputation had spread beyond a training facility to special operations units throughout the Navy and other service branches. The story was told and retold in briefing rooms, mess halls, and training facilities around the world. Each version emphasized slightly different aspects of the incident, but all versions reinforced the same core message: never underestimate someone based on their appearance or background. Danny Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Marcus Torres became unexpected beneficiaries of their humbling experience. Rather than being viewed as examples of student misconduct, they were seen as young men who had learned crucial lessons about respect, humility, and professional competence. Their willingness to acknowledge their mistakes and commit to improvement earned them respect from instructors who might otherwise have written them off as troublemakers. Danny proved particularly responsive to his new understanding of combat effectiveness. He enrolled in every additional training opportunity available and spent his free time studying military tactics and martial arts techniques. His transformation from arrogant bully to dedicated student became another part of the story that circulated through military training communities. Jake Sullivan channeled his competitive nature into legitimate skill development rather than empty posturing. He approached training with the same intensity he had once applied to intimidating smaller classmates, but now his efforts were focused on measurable improvement rather than social dominance. His intelligence, previously used for manipulation and troublemaking, became an asset for understanding complex tactical concepts. Marcus Torres used his family's military tradition as motivation rather than entitlement. He studied the careers of successful special operations personnel and began developing realistic goals based on competence rather than assumptions. His grandfather's stories of World War II heroism took on new meaning as Marcus learned to appreciate the training and preparation that made such heroism possible. The three men remained friends throughout their military training, but their relationship was now based on mutual support for improvement rather than shared arrogance. They studied together, trained together, and helped each other address individual weaknesses. Instructors noted their progress and began using them as examples of how proper attitude could accelerate skill development. Sarah continued her instructional duties with enhanced credibility and effectiveness. Students arrived in her classes with appropriate respect for her expertise and clear expectations about the training standards they would be required to meet. The skepticism and testing that had previously characterized the first days of new training cycles virtually disappeared. More importantly, Sarah's demonstration had broader impact on military training philosophy and methods. Training commands throughout the special operations community began emphasizing the importance of instructor credibility and the value of realistic demonstrations. The incident became a case study in leadership courses and instructor development programs. The story also influenced policies regarding women in special operations roles. Sarah's handling of the challenge to her authority demonstrated that female instructors and operators could maintain effectiveness and credibility in traditionally male environments. Her actions provided ammunition for advocates of expanded opportunities for women in combat roles. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the broader culture of military training. Sarah's 45-second lesson reinforced the fundamental principle that respect must be earned through demonstrated competence rather than assumed through rank or position. Students throughout the special operations community learned that questioning authority was acceptable, but that such questions should be approached with appropriate respect and willingness to learn. 6 months after the gymnasium incident, Danny Morrison, Jake Sullivan, and Marcus Torres graduated from their initial training program with honors. All three had been selected for advanced training programs that would prepare them for special operations careers. Their transformation from arrogant recruits to dedicated professionals validated Sarah's belief that proper instruction could overcome almost any attitudinal problem. The graduation ceremony included a brief speech by Commander Hayes, who praised the training facilities instructors for their dedication to developing exceptional military personnel. She made specific reference to the importance of maintaining high standards and expecting excellence from every student. Those who knew the background understood her comments as recognition of Sarah's contribution to training effectiveness. After the ceremony, Danny Morrison approached Sarah to thank her personally for the lesson she had taught him. "Ma'am, I know I was completely out of line that day in the gymnasium, but I want you to know that what happened changed my entire approach to military service. I learned more in those 45 seconds than I had learned in my entire life up to that point." Jake Sullivan and Marcus Torres expressed similar sentiments. All three men credited their encounter with Sarah as the moment when they began to understand what professional military service actually required. They had entered her classroom as civilians playing at being soldiers. They had left as students beginning to learn what it meant to be warriors. The 45-second lesson had achieved its intended purpose and more. 3 young men had learned humility and gained motivation. 21 witnesses had gained respect for professional competence. And the broader military community had received a powerful reminder that effectiveness comes from training, dedication, and skill rather than from assumptions about gender, size, or background. 2 years after the gymnasium incident, Sarah Chun found herself standing in the Pentagon's most secure briefing room, surrounded by some of the most senior special operations commanders in the American military. The men and women gathered around the polished mahogany table represented decades of combat experience and strategic thinking. They were discussing the future of special operations training and the integration of women into previously all-male units. Admiral James Richardson, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, was reviewing training effectiveness reports when he paused at a particular section. "Lieutenant Chun, I understand you've become something of a legend in our training community. Care to explain how a 45-second demonstration became one of the most discussed incidents in special operations training history?" Sarah had been preparing for this moment since receiving orders to brief senior leadership on training innovations and best practices. Her gym floor lesson had indeed become legendary, but more importantly, it had sparked broader discussions about leadership, authority, and effectiveness in military training environments. "Sir, the incident demonstrated several important principles that have broader applications for special operations training," Sarah began. "First, that respect and authority in military environments must be based on demonstrated competence rather than assumed superiority. Second, that proper training techniques can overcome almost any disparity in physical attributes. And third, that realistic demonstrations often teach lessons more effectively than theoretical instruction." General Margaret Maggie Stone, the first woman to command a special operations task force in combat, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Lieutenant, what impact has that demonstration had on your subsequent training effectiveness and student outcomes?" Sarah's response drew from extensive data she had collected over the past 2 years. "Ma'am, student attention and engagement in my classes improved dramatically following the incident. More importantly, the number of training-related disciplinary issues in classes I've taught has decreased by approximately 70% compared to previous averages." She paused to let that statistic register before continuing. "Students arrive in my classes with realistic expectations about training standards and appropriate respect for the instruction they'll receive. This allows us to focus on skill development rather than classroom management issues." Admiral Richardson nodded approvingly. "What about the 3 students directly involved in the original incident? How did their military careers develop?" Sarah smiled slightly before answering. "Sir, all 3 completed their initial training programs with distinction and went on to successful special operations careers. Morrison is currently serving with SEAL Team 7 and was recently recommended for advanced leadership training. Sullivan completed Marine Force reconnaissance training and has deployed twice to the Middle East. Torres was selected for Army Special Forces and is currently assigned to 10th Group." General Stone's expression suggested she found these outcomes particularly significant. "So the students who challenged your authority most directly became some of your most successful graduates?" "Yes, ma'am. The demonstration helped them understand that military effectiveness requires constant learning and improvement. Once they adjusted their attitudes, their natural intelligence and physical capabilities made them excellent candidates for special operations service." Colonel David Martinez, representing Air Force Special Operations Command, had been listening quietly, but now joined the conversation. "Lieutenant Chun, how has your experience influenced broader discussions about women in special operations roles?" Sarah understood that this question addressed one of the most sensitive topics in current military policy debates. "Sir, I believe the incident demonstrated that effectiveness in military roles depends on individual capability rather than gender or physical characteristics. The students involved learned to evaluate people based on demonstrated competence rather than assumptions or stereotypes. Admiral Richardson consulted his notes before asking his next question. Lieutenant, your demonstration has been studied and analyzed by training commands throughout the special operations community. What lessons do you think are most important for future instructor development? Sarah had given considerable thought to this question and was prepared with a comprehensive answer. Sir, I believe there are 3 critical lessons. First, instructors must maintain absolute confidence in their own capabilities and knowledge. Students can sense uncertainty or insecurity, and they will exploit those weaknesses. Second, instructors must be willing to demonstrate their competence when challenged appropriately. Theoretical knowledge alone is insufficient for maintaining credibility in special operations training environments. Third, demonstrations should be designed to teach lessons rather than to humiliate students. The goal is education, not dominance. General Stone asked the question that everyone in the room was considering. Lieutenant Shun, given your experience and the lessons learned from this incident, what recommendations would you make for integrating women more effectively into special operations training and operational roles? Sarah's answer would later be quoted in military leadership courses and policy discussions throughout the special operations community. Ma'am, I recommend that integration efforts focus on establishing clear performance standards that apply equally to all personnel, regardless of gender. Women seeking special operations roles should be required to meet the same physical, mental, and technical standards as their male counterparts. However, those standards should be based on mission requirements rather than artificial barriers. She continued with obvious conviction. More importantly, training programs should emphasize that effectiveness comes from competence rather than conformity to traditional expectations. Students need to learn that their teammates' value depends on ability to accomplish missions successfully, not on matching preconceived notions about what warriors should look like. Colonel Martinez nodded fully. How do we address situations where male personnel question women's capabilities based on physical characteristics rather than demonstrated performance? Sarah's response reflected 2 years of experience dealing with exactly these situations. Sir, the most effective approach is to ensure that women in special operations roles are so thoroughly trained and prepared that their competence becomes undeniable. When male personnel see women performing at exceptional levels consistently, assumptions and stereotypes tend to disappear quickly. Admiral Richardson was clearly impressed by Sarah's analysis and recommendations. Lieutenant, your incident has become a case study in multiple leadership courses throughout the military. What do you think makes it so compelling for students and instructors? Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. Sir, I think the story resonates because it demonstrates fundamental truths about leadership and competence that apply in many different situations. Students learned that assumptions can be dangerous, that respect must be earned through performance, and that effective leaders sometimes need to demonstrate their capabilities rather than simply assert their authority. General Stone asked a more personal question. Lieutenant Shun, how has this experience affected your own military career and professional development? Sarah's answer revealed the broader impact of her gymnasium lesson on military culture and policy. Ma'am, the incident has provided me with opportunities to influence training policies and practices throughout the special operations community. I've been able to contribute to discussions about instructor development, student motivation, and integration of women into previously all-male units. She paused before adding, more importantly, it's reinforced my belief that military service provides unique opportunities to challenge assumptions and demonstrate that effectiveness comes from training, dedication, and competence rather than from conforming to traditional expectations. The briefing continued for another hour, covering various aspects of special operations training and policy. But the discussion kept returning to the lessons learned from Sarah's 45-second demonstration and their applications to broader military challenges. As the meeting concluded, Admiral Richardson made an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. Lieutenant Shun, based on your contributions to training effectiveness and your insights into special operations integration issues, you're being recommended for early promotion to Lieutenant Commander and assignment as Executive Officer of the Special Warfare Training Group. The promotion represented recognition of Sarah's exceptional performance and her potential for senior leadership roles. More importantly, it positioned her to influence special operations training policy and practices on a much broader scale. After the briefing, General Stone approached Sarah privately. "Lieutenant, I want you to understand the significance of what happened in that gymnasium 2 years ago. Your actions didn't just teach 3 students about respect and competence. They demonstrated to the entire special operations community that women can maintain authority and effectiveness in the most challenging training environments." She continued with obvious conviction. "More importantly, you showed that proper training and professional competence trump physical characteristics and traditional assumptions. That lesson has implications far beyond special operations training." General Stone was right. Sarah's demonstration had indeed influenced discussions and policies throughout the military community. Training commands had revised instructor development programs to emphasize the importance of demonstrated competence. Leadership courses now included case studies based on Sarah's handling of challenges to authority. And integration policies for women in special operations roles had been informed by lessons learned from her experience. 6 months later, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun stood in front of a new class of instructor candidates, preparing to train the next generation of special operations teachers. Among her students were several women who would become the first female instructors in previously all-male training programs. Effective instruction requires more than just knowledge of your subject matter, Sarah told her students. You need to understand how to maintain authority, how to respond to challenges appropriately, and how to demonstrate your competence when necessary. She paused to make eye contact with each student before continuing. Some of you will face situations where your authority is questioned based on assumptions about your gender, your appearance, or your background. When those situations arise, remember that your response will influence not just your own credibility, but the credibility of everyone who comes after you. One of the female students raised her hand. "Ma'am, what's the best way to prepare for those challenges?" Sarah's answer reflected everything she had learned from her gymnasium experience and its aftermath. Train constantly, maintain absolute confidence in your abilities, and never forget that your competence speaks louder than any words. When someone questions whether you belong in a special operations training environment, the best response is to demonstrate exactly why you're there. The lesson continued, but Sarah's thoughts returned to that day 2 years earlier when 3 arrogant recruits had challenged her authority and learned a lesson they would never forget. The 45 seconds of action had lasted less than a minute, but their impact would continue for decades. Danny Morrison was now a senior petty officer leading his own SEAL team on challenging missions around the world. Jake Sullivan had been selected for Marine Special Operations and was serving as an instructor himself, passing along lessons about respect and competence that he had learned in Sarah's gymnasium. Marcus Torres was training indigenous forces in Afghanistan, using skills and understanding that traced directly back to his humbling encounter with a small woman who had taught him what professional competence actually meant. More importantly, hundreds of other students had learned similar lessons through similar demonstrations as Sarah's methods were adopted by instructors throughout the special operations community. The culture of military training had shifted to emphasize demonstrated competence over assumed superiority, and integration of women into special operations roles had accelerated as their capabilities became increasingly undeniable. Standing in that new classroom, preparing another generation of instructors, Sarah understood that her gymnasium demonstration had achieved something far more significant than teaching 3 students about respect. It had helped transform an entire military community's understanding of what makes warriors effective. The 45-second lesson had become a permanent part of special operations culture, ensuring that future generations of military personnel would judge their teammates based on competence rather than assumptions. And somewhere in the world, whenever a small woman in military uniform was underestimated because of her appearance, someone would remember the story of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chun and understand that the most dangerous warriors often come in the most unexpected packages. The lesson that had begun with 3 arrogant recruits thinking they could intimidate their instructor had become a legend that would influence military training for generations. In 45 seconds, Sarah had not only defended her authority and taught 3 students about respect, she had helped change the way an entire military community thought about competence, capability, and what it truly means to be a warrior. Years later, when military historians studied the integration of women into special operations roles, they would identify Sarah's gymnasium demonstration as a pivotal moment when assumptions gave way to evidence and stereotypes surrendered to demonstrated capability. The story would continue to be told in briefing rooms and training facilities around the world, reminding every generation of warriors that effectiveness comes from training, dedication, and skill rather than from conforming to outdated expectations about what warriors should look like. The 45 seconds that had humbled 3 arrogant recruits had ultimately helped humble an entire military culture's assumptions about gender, capability, and combat effectiveness. And that, Sarah understood, was a lesson worth teaching.